The Broken Blade, Chapter 18, Muckwa's Wigwam. How long will we be staying at the fort? Pierre asked Charbonneau the next morning. After complaining about too many questions before breakfast, Charbonneau explained that their layover would last a week. He told Pierre the crew would reassemble, Les Mackay, and several others who were taking the trade goods north. The Montreal canoes would bring bald furs back to Lachine, while the north canoes headed into the wilderness. During his vacation from paddling, Pierre wandered through the fort and encampments. Though he ran an occasional errand for Charbonneau or La Petite, he had a lot of free time. Mainly, he listened to the old-timers and learned as much as he could about the century-old trading system of the Northwest Territory. One afternoon, Pierre was helping La Petite sort through a load of trade goods. The big fellow tossed him one of the famous Northwest trading muskets to put on a gun rack. "Be careful," La Petite cautioned. "You're holding 20 plus in your hands." Pierre looked at the brass side plate of the gun with his familiar etched dragon and shook his head. "How can you keep track of all these pluses?" "Why, it's simple, lad," Mackay answered. "They are trading credits. 1 plus equals 1 prime beaver pelt. All our company men use the same formula. As each season begins, they give the Indian trappers credits based on the value of the prime beaver pelt. A butcher knife is worth 1 plus, a woolen blanket 8, a Northwest gun 20, and other things like kettles, hatchets, ironworks, cloth, and needles all have their own values. You give the Indians trade goods before they even bring in furs?" "Aye," Mackay responded. "It's all based on trust. I've seen some cheating done, but the whites mainly author it. If you give an Ojibwe a rifle in the fall, you can count on 20 pelts come spring." "But what about other furs?" Pierre asked. "If a prime beaver hide is 1 plus, a silver fox or a good bear hide can be worth 3 or even 4 plus. Some are worth a lot less. It might take 8 muskrat hides to equal a single plus. It all depends. Even the grade of beaver can vary. The finest we call winter greased beaver. It's caught in cold weather when the pelt is prime. Then it's worn by the Indians until the long hairs fall out, leaving a velvet soft." "Why so much interest in the trade?" Mackay inquired. "Are you think of wintering with us some season?" "Me? In an outpost?" Pierre reddened at the thought of becoming a hibernant. "Aye, and if you don't like the bulwark, tend to your studies. We need a lot of smart fellows to keep track of the money that pours in and out of the frontier." Mackay turned away. Pierre felt proud that his commander thought him smart enough to work as a clerk someday. When he considered the weight of a quill pen compared to a paddle, maybe schooling made sense after all. The trade item that Mackay didn't mention was the one that caused the most trouble: rum. On only his second afternoon at the fort, Pierre watched as 2 fellows who'd been drinking got into an argument over a woman just outside the stockade. It looked like an innocent squabble until one of the men pulled out a knife and jabbed it into the rival's kneecap. The wounded man stabbed the other fellow twice in the chest. The speed of it was dumbfounding. The braves were standing in the sun talking, and an instant later one was bleeding to death in the dust. With the help of his friends, the man with the gashed knee limped home, while the other was carried to the dispensary to die. Later that day, the brother of the dead man, a boy of only 10, went to the house of the man who'd killed his brother. He pushed the muzzle of the Northwest gun through the doorway and pulled the trigger. There were 2 funerals the next day. Pierre got a glimpse of one of them when he and Charbonneau were walking to Muckwa's for dinner. Charbonneau paused in front of a crowded wigwam. Through the doorway, Pierre saw a number of Ojibwe, both male and female, clustered around the corpse. They were drinking and crying. One man sat at the feet of the corpse, staring into space, while a woman knelt at the head of the body and sobbed, pouring liquor down the dead man's throat. "What are they doing?" Pierre whispered. "I'm not sure," Charbonneau shook his head. "Maybe they think the dead are just as fond of rum as the living." They walked on. Pierre asked how they'd met Muckwa. Charbonneau chuckled. "That's a strange one. I found him one winter near an outpost up on Lake Vermilion about 19 or 20 years back." Charbonneau paused. "He was just a boy, lying half dead in the snow. A Sioux war party had killed his entire family. Though Muckwa had a musket ball in his shoulder and another in his leg, he crawled across some thin creek ice and escaped. I built a fire to thaw him out and hauled him home on my dog sled. After I dug the lead out with a skinning knife, I waited for him to die, but he toughed it out. Following the custom of his people, he's been forever grateful." When they arrived at Muckwa's wigwam, Pierre was impressed by the quiet order. His wife, 3 children, and aged mother all greeted the visitors with polite nods, but they left the talking to the chief. The meal was superb. The courses included roasted venison, wild rice flavored with maple sugar, smoked trout, and a delicious stewed meat served in laced vessels molded out of white birch bark. As much as Pierre enjoyed the food, he couldn't help admiring Mukwa's oldest daughter, Kenawa, who passed dishes to the guests. Pierre expected the whole family to be dressed in gaudy clothing like their father, but Kenawa wore a simple white doeskin dress. Her eyes were deep brown and soft. Kenawa's gentle and quiet manner reminded Pierre of Celeste. It had been 6 weeks since he'd talked to a person his own age. There were 100 questions he wanted to ask, but the boldest thing he brought himself to offer was a smile. A baby who was about the same age as Pierre's little sister, Claire, sat across from him during the meal. Whenever Pierre winked at the child, he grinned broadly. Keewatin has found a friend, Mukwa commented, proud that his guest paid attention to his young son. Charbonneau and Mukwa spent the evening talking about old times. Lalonde's name came up more than once. It was clear he'd been a good friend to them both. Pierre listened quietly, but when Mukwa called Lalonde Snakebite, Pierre asked why. Charbonneau grinned. He was deathly afraid of snakes. It's funny, too, because none of us ever knew it until we went on a scouting trip down the Red River one spring. Mukwa was our guide. We were checking out the trading possibilities, and things were going along fine until we camped on a feeder stream on the Red one night. It was a low, boggy area, but we couldn't afford to be choosy since it was getting dark. We'd no sooner pitched our tent and crawled in our blankets when Lalonde let out a yelp and jumped up. A snake had tried to crawl up his leggings. We all laughed. It was just a harmless water snake, but Lalonde was so riled up he nearly pulled the tent down. To calm him, we lit a tallow candle and searched the bedding. Although we found 3 or 4 of those little rascals. Pierre shuddered at the thought. We threw the snakes out the door, tied the flap down tight, and got Lalonde settled in. Everything would have been fine if Mukwa here hadn't played the funny man and given Lalonde's big toe a hard pinch. Poor fellow jumped up again, yelping, "I'm bit! I'm snake bit!" "There's nothing to worry about, Lalonde," Mukwa said. "Them's just water snakes living in those old graves down by the river." After that comment, Charbonneau shook his head and grinned. He was too spooked to even think about sleeping. Poor fellow sat up the rest of the night staring at the tent flap with his blanket wrapped around him, muttering, "Snakes and graves." He caught up on his sleep the next day, Mukwa added. Lalonde could take a passable nap in the saddle, Charbonneau said, chuckling. He only fell off his horse twice all day. But that's what ended up saving our skins at the end of it all, Mukwa said. Charbonneau nodded. He and Mukwa sat in silence in a moment, pondering something that had happened long ago, but the talking was done. A short while later, Charbonneau and Pierre thanked Mukwa for his hospitality. Mukwa gave Charbonneau a hug, and Pierre bowed politely to both the chief and his family. On the way back to the fort, Pierre's curiosity got the best of him. "What did Mukwa mean by Lalonde saving your skins?" he asked. Charbonneau didn't answer right away. He began with a sigh. The next day we were coming up on a ridge when Lalonde, who'd been snoring for at least a mile, tumbled off his horse. Mukwa and I dismounted to help him when we heard some commotion just ahead. We tethered our horses and belly crawled up a hill. Below us was a Sioux war party marching south. A string of ponies stretched around the ridge and clear out of sight. The faces of the warriors were splattered with grime and blood. Scalp poles were slung over their shoulders. A long, blonde cascade of hair dangled from one pole, and we were close enough to see a pearl comb still tucked in place. It turned your stomach. He took a deep breath, but the worst was the 3 little gold locks of hair on the next pole. Before we knew it, Lalonde cocked his northwest gun and drew a bead on a Sioux. It would have been suicide, but I thought he was going to fire. After the last warrior passed, Lalonde still lay there, his gun cocked, sighting on the horizon. There were tears running down his cheeks. Pierre was still thinking of Lalonde when Charbonneau changed the subject. Charbonneau whispered, "Look," and pointed toward the waning moon. Below its slender arc, star-flecked superior stretched farther than Pierre could see. At that moment, as they stood alone in the silvery dark above the fort, Pierre remembered that he was halfway home.